Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Victoria Schuler, and I'm a project manager of HR services with the Canadian Agricultural Human Resource Council. We are doing a first webinar today of our webinar series as a part of Agri-HR Community of Practice that CARC is working on at developing. And some housekeeping items. The webinar will take approximately 60 minutes, including Q&A. This webinar is recorded, and the recording will be available at our YouTube channel in a couple of days. We are doing it in a meeting format, as we're hoping for a good discussion and sharing opinions and ideas. So if you are open to that, that would be great. If you have any questions as we come along, you can either raise your hand and Sara will take your questions, or just put your questions in the chat box and we will look at it at some point during the webinar as well. And Owen Wady is our marketing assistant. He will be responsible for our technical part of the webinar. If for some reason you're logged out and not able to get back, just email him. Owen will post his email in the chat box right now. And now we are starting. I would like to introduce Sara Mann. She would like to introduce herself, actually, like to start. And I hope everyone will have a good time and productive webinar.
That's awesome. Thanks, Victoria. Hello, everyone. How's everybody doing today? Good? Thumbs up for the people I can see. Thank you for turning your camera on. It feels a lot more personal when I can see your face. So my name is Sara Mann. I'm a professor at the University of Guelph. I did my PhD 17 years ago, and I've been at Guelph ever since. So my PhD is in human resource management. That's what I teach at the university. But more importantly, I think I live on a farm, which is where my interest in ag came from. So I started out doing research that was funded from OMAFRA about 17 years ago at the university, and it just kind of evolved into looking at employment issues in rural areas and also employment issues in the agricultural sector. So I specifically conduct research on the social and economic benefits of the seasonal agricultural worker program. So I'm really excited to be here today. I have to be honest, I really like in-person sessions a lot more because I can get some participation in the room. So I'm going to really try to encourage you to speak up so that we can get that feeling as if we're in the room together. And I do like this to be really informal. So if you have any questions as we go through the presentation, you can just even speak out if I'm not seeing that you have your hand up, or you can put something in the chat. So I think we're good to go. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so we are here today to talk about how to become an employer of choice. The reason why I titled it that is because I think that is the key to attracting and retaining workers within the agricultural sector. I'm going to start with an important slide, though. This is what research tells us. We forget 50% of what we hear immediately, 75% of what we hear within 2 months, and then of that 25% that we do remember, only 60% is correct. So why do I think this is important to share with you? Because it means you're hardly going to remember anything that I tell you today. In fact, you're probably going to forget most of it immediately. But that doesn't mean that it's not time well spent. Anytime I do a training session like this, I always think that if you can walk away with just one thing that you're going to do differently, it's time well spent. So I'm going to throw a lot of ideas at you. Some are going to resonate with you. Some aren't. Some you might not agree with. And if you don't agree, I'd encourage you to speak up. But just to remember, just jot down 1 or 2 things that you're going to take away from the webinar, and it is time well spent. So I am not going to go through all of these slides in detail. I put them on here, though, just to kind of set the tone for what I feel the agricultural industry is facing right now. I think you've got 2 really major challenges. One of them being the supply of labor, right? So we know how difficult it is to attract and retain labor. The labor pool is small, but secondly, it's very hard to retain people given the working conditions and the challenges that we have in the industry. So I think some industries have either a supply problem, but they're able to retain their labor, or the other way around. But what I see with the ag sector is that you've got both. And that is really what I would call the perfect storm. So these are the slides I'm not going to go into, but here's all of the factors that I'm sure you're well aware of factors that we can't control, right? Our harvesting cycle, seasonality of work. I mean, I'm not going to read them. You can look at the slides after, but I mean, there's even another slide that again, negative perceptions of the sector, increased shortage of domestic labor, reliance on temporary foreign workers. These are all factors that we can't control, but that have a huge impact on our ability to attract and retain workers. Here's some really interesting stats that actually came from CARC's Ag employer survey. I mean, 50% of employers in Ontario can't hire the workers that they need. 45% of ag employers in Ontario receive 0 applications. Like, think about that. 45% receive 0 applications. I can see some people nodding their heads, right? That is not what we see in other sectors. The labor gap continues to grow. And in addition to that, 37% of the ag workforce is expected to retire by 2029. We did some work this year on trying to find the economic impact of this labor shortage and also the temporary foreign workers, but it's very, very difficult to estimate. We do have one estimate that says unfilled vacancies cost the province about $591 million. So we know this is a massive issue. These are all things we cannot control, but what I want to talk to you today is about things that I think you can control as a manager, as an owner, in your operation. So you certainly can control the recruitment of your employees. Also the hiring of your employees, what the process looks like, what type of interview questions you're going to ask. Are you going to find the right person for the job? And then of course, retention. And what I'm going to focus on is really retention, because retention is a long-term strategy that will allow you to attract and keep your employees. So I'm going to try and format this webinar in a bit of an exercise true false so that we can try to get some discussion going and get you thinking. So I'm just going to go through a series of true false questions and let's see where we get to. So first question, true or false? The most effective leaders are supportive and encourage participation. So Owen, I think we have a poll that I'd like to pose to you to help us to answer that question. If we were in a room together, I would put these 4 leadership styles on the 4 corners of the room. In one corner, we would have what we call directive leaders. These are leaders that tell people what to do. They give clear expectations, they provide resources, they just are very directive and they don't ask for input. On the right-hand corner, we have achievement-oriented leaders. These are leaders that are focused on setting goals. So they set goals, they track progress on the goals. Bottom left corner, leaders that are supportive and encouraging. And then the bottom right, participative. They ask their employees to participate, provide suggestions, recommendations. So the poll, I'd like you to choose in the chat which of these leadership styles motivates you the most. The reason why I want to focus on leadership before we get to attraction and retention is because it really is the foundation of everything that you do to create a strong workplace culture in order to become that employer of choice. So I can see it looks like we've got most of our answers in, so I can end the poll, Owen. Okay, look at that. So nobody chose directive, but I can bet that you do have employees that work for you that are motivated by directive behavior, especially in the ag sector. We actually see this quite a bit. And then we have kind of an even split between achievement-oriented and participative, but mostly people are motivated by a supportive or encouraging style. Before I tell you what that means, let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to change the question. Which of these leadership styles do you think is most effective? So not the one that motivates you the most, but which one of these do you think is the most effective? And we have another poll for you. Isn't that, like, to me, this is really fascinating, right? So I ask you what motivates you, but the answers change when I ask you which one of these is most effective. Does anyone want to explain to me why they chose the style that they chose? I'm curious, I don't know who chose, but anyone that chose directive, could you explain why you think that's the most effective? Okay, no worries. I will answer the question for you. So maybe we can end the poll, Owen, so everyone can see the results. So again, we're all over the map, right? That's so fascinating to me that it would change of what motivates you versus what's the most effective. Now, why would I share this to you? So if we were in a room together, this is what it would look like, right? We would have people around at every different style. And usually in the room, I have someone that puts their hand up and says, but can I stand right in the middle? And that's where we want to be. Why would we want to be in the middle? We don't want to have one of these 4 leadership styles all the time. Anybody have any thoughts? Okay, well, I'll give you the answer. Hoping we're going to get more participation as we go. The answer is it depends. So I don't know if I've met any of you before in any previous training sessions, but these are 2 words that you will remember if you ever see me again, because I'm going to use it so much in this webinar. Everything that you do when it comes to managing and leading your employees depends. So it depends on the employee and what motivates them. It depends on what kind of job they're in, what the culture of your company is like, what the company strategy is, what the economy is like. There's so many factors that go into how to effectively lead or manage. I can't just give you one way and tell you this is how you do it, because it all depends on the situation. So if at any point during this presentation, I call any of you out and ask you for an answer, you just say it depends, and it will be the right answer to any question that I ask you. I tell my students, always just answer with it depends on an exam. You're going to get part marks because it's the answer to everything when we talk about managing and leading our employees. And I just put this photo in here for a little bit of fun, but I don't know if you're familiar. At the University of Guelph, we have a cannon that students paint every day. So they paint messages on it so that the campus community can see what they're thinking. And these were my Masters of Leadership students. They painted "it depends" on the cannon because I taught those 2 words to them so many times. That was interesting fact. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So the answer to that first one was false, right? Not everyone's motivated by supportive or encouraging leadership. And so we want to alter our leadership style depending on the situation. So true or false, there are certain traits that are common to all leaders, and everyone has the same perception of what being an effective leader entails. So I'm just going to give you a second to think, maybe 5 seconds. Try and think of 1 or 2 behaviors or traits that you think an effective leader has. Okay, and then we're going to do a poll. So which of these is the most important leadership behavior or characteristic? So communicator, being fair, clear instructions, delegating, being competent, being supportive. Which one of those jumps out at you as the most important for being an effective leader? Okay, I think we can end the poll, Owen. Okay, so look at this. This is really interesting. This answers this question. And I'll just actually go back to the true or false question, which was there are certain traits that are common to all leaders, and everyone has the same perception of what being an effective leader entails. So we know that's false. So look at this. 3 people, or sorry, of everyone here, you chose 3 different behaviors or characteristics of what being an effective leader is. It's very much aligned with the leadership style question to tell you it really depends on the individual and what motivates them as to what type of leadership behavior you need to exhibit. So why is this important? Because it means that you need to recognize that different people are motivated by different things, and you need to alter the way you lead and manage depending on that individual. So the first part of that question, though, are there traits that are common to all leaders? It's actually kind of interesting. The leadership research started back in 1970, and they tried to determine exactly what traits would predict effective leadership. And what they found is that they ended up with thousands of traits. Because you might find a leader that is very charismatic, but is not an effective communicator. But if you find that each of those traits independently predict leadership, it just didn't work. So that's where we came up with this contingent approach to leadership. So this tells us that different people, again, motivated by different types of leadership characteristics. If we were to put all of your ideas around what being an effective leader look like on a wall, if you can picture if we had sticky notes, this is maybe something along the lines of what we would come up with. So we'd come up with the fact that some people, as our poll just showed, a lot of people think that being an effective communicator, even though they're not exactly the same terms, right? Effective communicator, a good listener, listens well, that lots of people think those are characteristics of an effective leader. But then we can have drastically different perspectives. We could have someone that's looking for a leader that's honest, but someone that says a leader is directive. Think of how different, not opposite, but different those leadership styles are. So again, just recognizing that different people are motivated by different things, and that affects how we lead and manage, affects how we attract and retain people. True or false? Everyone can be a leader because leaders can be trained. So very interesting study that was done in the University of Minnesota. They took thousands of sets of twins, identical and not identical, raised together and raised apart, and they looked at their leadership characteristics and behaviors later on in life. What they were able to determine is that about 50% of your leadership capability is innate. The other is within you. The other 50% can be trained. I just thought that was an interesting perspective, and I would hope the answer is true, because otherwise we're wasting our time, right? So we know that 50% of your ability to be a leader can be trained, and I think that's great news. What about this one? True or false? Being an effective leader and an effective manager are the same thing.
No.
Oh, good. Someone, no? Okay, why do you think no?
No, because it is different. I think it is different responsibilities on each one of them. You can probably, like you just said, you can be a leader because it is a nature in the way you are, but not effective manager because you don't have that type of organization of managing all the responsibilities you have within the company, or all the way around. You can be managing the company very well without being effective with your employers or your team around you. I think it is totally different there.
Okay, so I agree. They're totally different, right? A leader is someone that's usually charismatic, can get people to follow them, to follow their vision and buy into their vision, whereas a manager is someone that provides clear instructions, feedback on performance, resources, totally different.
Yeah. Which
do you think is more important? Is it more important to be an effective leader or manager?
Both of them.
Okay, I would say you want to be both, but it's very rare to find someone that is actually an effective leader and an effective manager. Ideally, we want both. Which of these is most important? It depends, right? It depends on the situation. It depends the level of the position, who you're leading and managing. If there's quite often in the ag sector, you're in a time crunch or there's time constraints for what you're doing. You don't necessarily in those situations have the ability to focus on being an effective leader. You need to be an effective manager in that situation. So just to recognize that an effective leader and effective manager are different things, we're really going to focus, now that we've covered leadership, on what we can do from a management perspective to attract and retain workers. Okay, so how do we attract more workers? I don't have an answer for you on this. If there was an easy answer, we wouldn't all be sitting in the same situation wondering how we're going to recruit people. There is no easy answer. It's really about having a long-term strategy. So the best thing you can do to attract workers is to become that employer of choice. In the ag industry especially, we see that mostly we recruit through word of mouth. Think back to that stat from one of the first few slides where we said 45% of employers in ag get 0 applicants. Word of mouth is a really great way for you to focus on recruiting new employees, the importance of your network. I would say everything that you're going to learn today and everything that you do to focus on retaining your employees is a long-term strategy to become that employer of choice so that it gets out in the community and people want to work for you. So if there was an easy way that I could teach you how to recruit, I would obviously share that with you. And I don't think the industry would be in such a crisis when it comes to the supply of labor. But what I'm going to focus on now is how do we find the right person? How do we retain them? And then how do we get word out there that we're an employer of choice and we're the type of organization or operation that people want to come and work for us. Having said that, just let me ask if anybody in the audience, do you have anything that you've done that's been really effective in attracting, recruiting employees? Have you done anything innovative?
Sara?
Yeah.
I'm coming at this webinar from a different angle. I'm actually an international recruiter, and so when you talk about becoming an employer of choice, a lot of who we're trying to help and who we work with are farms that are looking for 5 guys. And the fellow who's been the owner of the farm, who's been doing this for 40 years, that is the last thing on his mind, to become an employer of choice. You know, he's I think if you're talking to a big company and a larger corporation, that's a relevant conversation. But to someone who, I think the wording might be, I understand what you're saying, but the wording would be different. Is, you know, how are you going to treat these guys when they get here? You know, you just have to bring it to speak at a different level. And to answer your question, what have we done to attract more employees? There are people in different countries who are desperate to come to Canada and work, and will work for the wages that we're offering. So we are reaching out to people in these countries, you know, Eastern Europe, South Africa, Mexico, and they what the job is almost secondary. They just want an opportunity to live in a safe country. So there's lots of opportunity out there to find these people. So, and I'm not trying to pump my own tires here, but if you're working with someone who is trying to reach these people, there's solutions to these problems. So yeah, so that's just one, you know, what have we done to attract more employees? Furthering our reach is what we're doing as a recruitment agency.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I fully support, as I said, my research is on the social and economic benefits of the temporary foreign worker program. So I fully support it. I really structured this presentation around attracting and recruiting domestic workers because I know we're going to have future webinars that are going to focus on TFWs.
Mm-hmm.
So I think so this is aimed at domestic workers. I did look at the registration list and thought employer of choice is really the right wording for the audience that I have here today. But I live on a farm. I'm in a small farming community. My husband would be one of those farmers.
Yeah.
The wording changes. Like I agree because this is, you know, it's so real to them that they can't find employees on their farm. I think it's all about positioning.
Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciate that for sure.
Yeah, and another thing, Sara, with our youth who are not necessarily interested in working on a farm, their attention deficit disorder. And when you work, a lot of farmers want you to put in 12, 16-hour days, and our young kids, that just is not, if you were to ask my son to do that, he'd be like, are you kidding me? I wouldn't even care if I was getting paid $25 an hour. I'm not doing that. So, you know, what do you think about our young people who have this higher expectation of, you know, what they want to do, or, you know, how do you attract our youth to enter into this industry? I'd be curious to hear what others are possibly doing to attract younger people.
For sure. So I'll say that's not a problem that's unique to ag. That is a problem. And I don't even know if the word, if it's not a problem, it's a challenge in other industries, right? We need to alter the way that we lead and manage according to the generation that we're dealing with. And from my perspective, I do a lot of these training sessions and leadership training programs in ag. From my perspective, people don't want to hear it. They don't have patience for it. I've had participants come up to me and say, you know, I don't appreciate any of this because they should just be lucky that they have a job. And that's not the mentality of younger workers that we're dealing with today.
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mhm.
That to me is not necessarily unique to ag. That's everywhere. And I think it goes back to those factors at the beginning of the webinar of all those things that we can't control. Like that difficulty in attracting youths is something that we can't control. Now, can we do things within our own operation to try to attract them? For sure. I know I read some interesting research. Kevin Elder, Victoria, the organization's escaping me. I'm so sorry. Food Skills Processing Canada, I think. Anyways, they did some interesting research on perceptions of the ag industry. And what they found was that 20% of individuals or potential employees have a negative perception. Something like 20% have a positive, but there's still that 60% that we have the opportunity to influence. And so how do we influence that 60% to encourage them? And so, I do think that in ag, given the difficulties with working conditions and other challenges, that we have to go above and beyond in order to find and keep people if we're looking for domestic workers for sure. And I see someone's got their hand up. Leslie, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to chime in a little bit as well. Being an employer of choice is definitely a goal for, I think, many people in my industry. I'm in the landscape construction, farm workers working in the field, growing trees and shrubs, etc., growing things. So employer of choice has a lot of good qualities to the terminology. I'm afraid that our young people don't understand what it means, nor do our clients that we're trying to retail to at the retail end of the other end of the farm. And then when it comes to the youth not wanting to work, everybody's touched on that. It is true, and I know I'm extremely blunt. I'm not very political in how I talk, but my message is much the same, that our youth are different. And I had the most horrendous year last year trying to get my head around working with a young lady who's probably 20, I think she's 25 years old. Oh gosh, no, she's older. She is actually 32 because she's a little older than my daughter. It was mind-bending for me. I don't think that way. So becoming an employer of choice, I think, has to come to educating, not only showing how good I am. I checked all the right boxes. I did all my classes. I know how to diversify. I know exactly how to incorporate all levels of diversity into my company. I welcome everyone. That's not going to help me understand my youth that don't think like me. I'm as ADD as the day is long. I have struggled that my whole life. I'm almost 60, and it's been a challenge. I get that. And I know how to deal with that person, but I don't know how to deal with our young people today. I'm learning, but that's where being an employer of choice, I think that piece needs to come in. I feel like that's missing.
So how do you find out what would motivate and keep? And I won't even just say a young employee, right? Let's
Talking
just
to you.
literally you're having someone, like, how do you find out what
I
would
had to spend a lot of time talking to them, and I just had to sit right down and open up the door and say, why don't I get what you're telling me? Why don't I get your needs? Why do you need to work a 32-hour week? How are you making your ends meet? I know you want $30 an hour. I'm exaggerating. So you want 20, but you only want to work 32 hours. But what about the week that you want 40? How am I going to afford that? And what if you only come in for 20 hours because you have needs? This is my struggle, is that they don't show up. So I have to hire 3 people to fill one job. And they all want $15 to $20 an hour.
right?
It's
It's a reality. It's a reality for sure, right?
and I need to get better at understanding it and how to be faster than them, because I'm behind the ball at the moment.
So there's a really interesting exercise called a perspective taking exercise where,
Okay.
okay, so you and this person or multiple employees sit down and you actually write out how you think the other person is feeling and what their perspective is, and then you share it. And it can really get people to be on the same page to better understand.
Okay.
Because I can bet this person has probably not put themselves in your shoes. It sounds like you have tried to put yourself in their shoes, but I don't think they have done that for you. So I think having that conversation could really help.
That's a great idea. And I think that's a great step. Thank you.
But yeah, let's talk about motivation in a minute, but I love the discussion, and I have a feeling we could probably sit here all afternoon and chat. And that's why I'm going to put a plug in for our discussion groups, because through the community of practice, we are going to be hosting discussion groups every 2 weeks, exactly this type of dialogue. So I did one in the summer with a commodity group, where all of the producers were from the same commodity. And it was just incredible to be able to share knowledge in that type of setting together. You know, what works, what doesn't work. And so I definitely want more discussion as we get to the next section. But if we could just move on a little bit and then we'll come back to that.
Do
Go
keep
ahead,
me in the loop for that when it comes up. Thank you.
Victoria.
Yeah, just as a part of a future discussion group and something we may need to think, and that's what COG has been doing. It's about recruitment and retention of workers for different generations, because what is important for someone who is 50 years old is not important for someone who is 20. And when we talk about generational recruitment, it's different messages, different motivation strategies, and different approaches. Well, we can also put a placeholder for a discussion group about that.
So yeah, for sure. And, you know, I'm going to talk a lot about fairness as we go through this presentation, because treating your employees fairly is actually one of the biggest motivators. The trick is, how do you treat your employees fairly, but differently according to various factors, right? So it's not easy. That's why I say this, it depends. There's just so much of really self-reflection as to what your strengths are, what the person needs, like, and it sounds, Leslie, like you're doing a lot of that. And let's get to that when we get back to motivation. I'm just gonna try to get through a couple more slides and then we'll have another discussion question. So actually I'm gonna go very quickly through hiring, because our first discussion group is, I believe, actually on hiring, and that's next week. And we can talk about it in more detail. I have a lot of thoughts on hiring and finding the right person for both the organization and also for the job, while also being legally defensible. So hiring, I don't want to try to cram this into a couple of slides. I just wanted to put a plug in for the discussion group and to say we can talk about that in more detail. But really, hiring, I think, is probably of less of a priority because your labor pool is so small that in ag, sometimes you tend to have to hire people that you interview because the labor pool is so small, right? So what I could try to focus on, how do you find the right person and how do you hire in a legally defensible way? And we'll talk about that when we get to the discussion groups, because I really want to focus the remainder of our time on retention. I will say, though, this last bullet point on this slide, a realistic job preview is something that we have found, especially in the ag sector, is incredibly valuable. So a realistic job preview is when you actually say exactly what the job, if it's not great working conditions, you tell the person that. There was one organization that I recently was talking to that has videos that they show the employees before they hire them that are very realistic about the working conditions that they're going to entail. Or going to experience. You're not doing anyone any favors by not providing realistic information as to what the job is going to look like, because we end up with our employees having something we call unmet expectations, which means it's not what they expected. And that's why we get a lot of turnover very, very quickly. Again, in the industry, from my experience, we see turnover happens like within the first week, maybe the first 2 weeks. If we can hang on to that person for the first couple of weeks, then we're going to be more likely to retain them for a long period of time. So I'm going to actually skip over this discussion question unless anyone has a burning sense to discuss this right now, and we'll save it for the discussion group next week, but something that you could think about, you know, what have you done that has worked or hasn't worked to hire the right person, to select the right person, whether it be job interviews, you know, looking at resumes. Like I said, with this type of labor pool, it's, you know, hiring to me is probably a lower priority than attraction and retention. But anyways, we will discuss it next week. I really want to spend our time on retention. So how do we get people to stay working at our farm? So true or false, there is only one way an employee can be committed to an operation. So what I mean by this is someone is committed if they don't quit, if they show up to work on time, if they don't call in sick unless they're really sick, right? They're committed to being there. They're not going anywhere. So the answer to this is that it's false. There are actually 3 ways that a worker can be committed. And I want you to think about the people on your farm or on your operation and see which of these 3 categories they fall into. So a worker can have what we call continuance commitment, which is when they're committed because they have to be. So maybe it's a small town and there's not a lot of options for them to work at another farm or another operation. I worked at a steel mill for many years. A lot of people were very close to retirement. Everyone was just hanging on because they had a pension. So were they showing up to work every day? Yes, but they were there because they had to be. We don't want people working and staying with us because they have to be there. Normative commitment is when people are committed because they feel like they should be. So we see this actually quite a bit in ag because maybe maybe you're working for a family organization and you feel like you should work there. Maybe a friend got you the job. So for myself, when I did my MBA and I was working, my organization paid for my schooling. I felt like I should stay even though I didn't want to. Both continuance and normative are not the types of commitment that we want our employees to have. What we want is what we call affective commitment. We want our workers to love where they work, to say great things about it, to spread the word of mouth about what a great employer it is. You know, I was going to say employer of choice, but now you're making me question whether I should use that terminology or not, but you know what I mean. You know, I love the University of Guelph, love it. It is, you know, student-centered, friendly, it feels like family. So I live actually in Dundas, so I'm about 5 minutes from Hamilton. And I'm about 45 minutes from Guelph. If, you know, I'm never leaving the University of Guelph because I love it there. That's how you want your employees to talk about where they work. What do you think drives effective commitment? What are some things that could contribute to our employees saying those things about where they work?
I would say they feel appreciated. They feel that their employer cares about them and their family. The work is not mind-numbing, so there's a bit of variety. Even if it is a monotonous job, there is some way that the employer makes it, changes it up for them in some way, shape, or form. But I think appreciation and feeling that their employer cares about them. And if there's time to have some fun while you're at work, then that is helpful too. I know I've heard people say that, you know, you could dig a ditch beside somebody as long as you're having a good time who you're digging that ditch with. So culture is important.
For sure. I agree with all of that. And remember though, some people, it might be pay, right? It depends on the individual and what point in their life they're at, what their situation is. The point is it depends again on every individual and what causes them to love the place that they work. So when you think about the ag industry and, you know, recently we did some research where we found one of the biggest struggles was that someone could go and work at Starbucks or Amazon for the same or more money. Why would they work on a farm? And my response to that is you need to provide, whether it's programs, incentives, rewards, anything you can do to build a positive culture, like you just said, so that people have effective commitment and they don't want to go work somewhere else. But it is a huge challenge. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that, but I know that it is, you know, I recently spoke to a large meat processor who Amazon recently built a warehouse near them, very close to them. That really hurt their ability to recruit, because when you have Amazon right next door and they're going to pay the same or more money and the working conditions are better, how do you attract and retain people? How do we get them to have effective commitment? We need to be really creative on how we're going to create a positive workplace culture where people want to stay. So again, just to keep in mind, that's the type of word of mouth that we want people to be spreading, is that they love the place that they work.
I would just make a comment that when it comes to the feels of my employees, I have a cat that it is the bane of my existence, that my staff insist on carrying it, petting it, holding it, dragging it around. And I'm highly allergic to the mouse catcher. And it's taking all of my strength not to fire the cat because I can't get the staff to work. But that's kind of leading to what you're saying, is that they're coming, one lady's coming to work because she gets to see the dumb cat. And I struggle with it. So it's a me problem, I know, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you. I've never heard an example like that before. That's a good one. But I do think recognizing that different things motivate different people, and, you know, being willing to accept that where it's possible, and it's not always possible. Okay, I'm going to keep going. True or false, people are mostly motivated by money. So I think, Owen, we're going to put a poll up here. And I would like you to choose which of the following motivates you the most. Okay, interesting. I think we can probably, oh, hang on, still got a couple more trickling in. Okay, and there we go. So what can we tell from this? That it depends, right? Everyone's motivated by different things. So one person chose money. 3 people said a flexible working arrangement. Feelings of accomplishment and feelings of being challenged. That is actually what we call intrinsic motivation. So different people are motivated by different things. Here's the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So extrinsic motivation is what we typically assume people are motivated by. And that's things like pay, benefits, vacation, promotion. It's tangible things. Whereas intrinsic motivation it's feelings from within. It's feeling challenged, feeling appreciated. So which one of these do you think is most motivating to people? The answer is it depends. So why is this important? Because it's important for you to sit down and to actually make a list of each of the people that work for you and to think about what motivates them. And then to ask them, right? How many times have you actually asked your employees what motivates them? What makes them tick? I always think going to a webinar or any type of training program is a great opportunity to go back and say, I just went through this course or this session and it got me thinking. I've never actually asked you what motivates you. For myself, my own staff, I do something called a stop, start, continue with them. So we sit down, we say, what do you want me as your boss to stop, start, and continue doing? I ask them to write those 3 things out before we meet. And then I ask a 4th question. What's one thing that I could change about your job that would make things better for you? I also heard of an organization recently that asked very similar type of question, but when was the last time that you thought of quitting and what was the reason? So just those types of questions to ask people and get their opinion on what you as a leader, as an owner, can stop, start, and continue doing differently. And then what's something that I can do to improve your job? And honestly, I think you're going to find that more often than not, it's very easy to change those small little things that can make a really big difference to people. So you don't want to automatically assume that what they want is, you know, it's so out there that you couldn't give it to them. Quite often there are things that we're able to achieve. Okay, I'm just in the sake of time. I'm not going to go into detail about performance appraisals, but I do want to say, well, you know what? I will actually, Victoria, we're okay if I go right till 1, right? Because we're having the discussion as we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I will do this one actually. True or false? How many people actually do a performance appraisal? It's actually through StatsCan research that in the ag sector, it's about 60%. That we found of organizations that actually do performance appraisals. We are going to have a discussion group on this topic. This is definitely my area of expertise, and I'd love to share some more details about it. But to say, if you're not doing performance appraisals, you need to be very, very concerned, not even just from a motivational standpoint, but also from a legal standpoint. And this is when I do my training sessions, always put a little plug-in for CARP's HR toolkit. Especially for producers, it's a very low-cost way to purchase performance appraisal tools that are legally defensible and very easy to modify according to your organization. So I'm going to cover a couple things here on motivation that tie into performance appraisals. So even if you don't do performance appraisals yet, and we'll talk about that in our discussion group, but even if you don't do them, there's some important things that we can take away with respect to motivation. So first of all, the most important thing to remember about doing performance appraisals is that it's linked to some form of compensation. Do you think that's true or false? I would say, especially in an industry where there's tight margins, it's very difficult to have rewards that are tied to performance. Right? So I'm actually going to say this is false. It's not the most important thing. Is it important that we do have, you know, our employees have a line of sight to say, I did a certain level of performance and I got a reward for it? That's ideally where we want to get to. But really the most important thing about a performance appraisal is that it's fair. And I told you earlier I was going to talk about fairness. In addition to it depends, fairness is the second thing that I really want you to take away from this webinar. There's 3 types of fairness. Interactional fairness is if our employees feel like they're treated with respect. Distributive fairness is whether our employees feel like they're paid fairly relative to their coworkers. Those 2 are both important, but they're not nearly as important as what we call procedural fairness. So procedural fairness is questioning whether the decisions that you make as an owner, as a manager, are the decisions fair? And more importantly, are you communicating how you're making your decisions so that people can see that how you're making those decisions is fair? So I'm going to give you a couple of really simple examples, but just to illustrate how important this is. So for myself, years ago, my boss moved up to a different position and her big corner office became available. So she came to me and she said, Sarah, I was the faculty advisor at the time. You're dealing with students all the time. It makes sense for you to have this big office because you're the one that meets with the students. So I took the big office. She sent a short email out to everyone to say, this is why I gave Sarah the big office. And it was fine. No one complained. Everyone understood. If she hadn't sent that simple email, people would have questioned why I was the one that got the office. So even though her decision-making was fair, it's the fact that she communicated what that decision was that people actually didn't question it. Another example, I did some consulting with an organization where we're having a lot of morale issues within a department. So we went around and interviewed everybody in the department and everyone said the same thing. Our boss makes all of these decisions very secretively. She's so unfair. Then we went to meet with the supervisor and she said, you know what? The biggest problem for me is the location of my office. So the coffee maker and the photocopier were right outside her office. She had a glass window that overlooked that area. So she said, I always have to keep my blind shut and my door closed. Otherwise, I'd never get any work done. It's just too loud. So we moved her office. We moved her office to a place where her door could be open. The perception was no longer that she was making decisions that weren't fair or behind closed doors. And just that one small little thing turned the morale around within the department. So all of that to say that it's not just as important that you're making fair decisions, but it's important that you're communicating how you're making decisions. And it can be very small decisions. It can be decisions on who's taking vacation when, who you're putting on what shift, what piece of equipment, any decision you make. It's a really good exercise for you for a week as a manager or as an owner. Write down basic decisions that you're making and then ask yourself, first of all, I think I have a slide on this. Do your employees feel like the decisions that you're making are fair? Are you making them in a fair way? Have you communicated how you're making the decisions? And then do you apply the same process to everyone? Those 3 questions will determine whether or not you have what we call procedural fairness. So that is one of the biggest motivators for our employees. And I'd really encourage you to think about how you can better implement that in order to retain workers. I'm going to quickly go through. I'm sorry, I have a lot more that I can share, and I will save these for our discussion groups. I will kind of end on this note, and then maybe we'll save time for questions and answers. These are really what I would say the 3 biggest mistakes. Well, this isn't what I would say. This is what research tells us. 3 of the biggest mistakes that managers often make. First of all, we underestimate the importance of intrinsic motivation. So when I asked about effective commitment, I think, Tammy, it was you that said, feelings of accomplishment, feeling challenged, those are intrinsic motivators. We tend to underestimate the importance of them and the role that they can play in motivating our employees. Managers also forget that different people are motivated by different things. We don't want to assume that people are motivated by the same thing as us. We have a tendency to do that, to assume that they're motivated the same way that we are. And we can't assume that because everyone's motivated differently. And lastly, managers tend to, and we don't want to, confuse rewards with reinforcers. So a reward could be a holiday bonus, something that's just given out consistently to employees that's not tied to performance, whereas a reinforcer is actually tied to your performance appraisal, or it could be the company's performance. We don't want to confuse the 2. If we're looking to increase motivation, then we're going to look at providing reinforcers, which are rewards that are tied to performance. If we're looking at just increasing morale and culture within the organization, then we want to look at rewards, but they're 2 very, very different things. I can't help it. I have to go on just do a couple more slides. I don't want to end that way, so bear with me. I'm going to end with this because I think it's a cool story of thinking about other factors other than just individual factors that can influence whether or not your employees are motivated if they want to stay with your organization. The 3 organizational factors are culture, structure, and strategy. So even those 3 organizational factors are also going to affect how you lead and manage and whether your employees stay with you or not. So let me ask you this one, true or false? Do you think strong organizational cultures are always good cultures? First of all, what is culture? It's just a feeling that you get about the organization. The definition is shared norms, values, beliefs, but it's really just the feeling of the organization. If I were to ask you, and I won't put anyone on the spot, but to write down 3 words that describe the culture of where you work. So take 5 seconds, or 10 seconds, see if you can come up with 3 words. So if we can come up with words easily to describe the culture of where we work, then we say it's a strong culture. If we were to ask several people in the organization and they use similar words, that's a strong culture. Do you think that that necessarily is a good culture? Definitely not, right? I've worked at an organization that I would say was bureaucratic, authoritative, old boys network. Like I could come up with a ton of words to describe that organization that I worked at. They're not positive words. It was not a good culture, but wow, was it ever a strong culture? Alternatively, I could have a weak culture where I can't really describe what the culture is, but it's still really positive. We see this a lot in the ag sector with all of the, especially in the crop input side of things, with all the mergers and acquisitions that are going on. When companies merge, their culture is weak for a while while they figure out what their culture is going to be. Culture really has an impact on whether people are motivated, whether they have effective commitment. So we want to keep culture in mind. Secondly, true or false, the organization chart is just a document. It doesn't have any impact on leadership or whether people stay. And I'm going to say this is completely false. It's not, it depends. And I'm going to share with you, and I know this looks like a large organization, but I can promise you any of you can put this to your organization no matter how small it is. This is what we would call a mechanistic structure or organizational chart. So this would be a structure that's very tall, lots of rules, lots of bureaucracy, all the decision-making happens at the top. So even if we have a small farm, we could still have a structure that's very mechanistic because it's very bureaucratic and top-down. Or we could have a type of structure that's what we call organic, which is more flat, open door policy. People are encouraged to make decisions and to have influence. So which of these is better? Of course, the answer is it depends. And organizations are not either mechanistic or organic. They're usually somewhere right in the middle. So think about how you lead and manage your employees and how it would differ in each of these structures, right? If I have the tall bureaucratic type of structure, and I'm the type of leader that is, asks for lots of input and get people involved and says, come and sit down and we'll discuss things in my office, it might not go over well in that type of structure. Alternatively, if we have a flat structure like this one, and we start to impose rules and bureaucracy and red tape, that's not going to be effective either. So in addition to all of these individual factors that we need to think about and the culture, we also need to think about the structure of our company and even how that is going to impact how we're going to lead and manage. And last thought before I leave you, because I know we're already almost over time, I'm going to share a story, and it's a personal story, but for me, it's something where the light bulb really went off for me with respect to leading and managing. Really simply, if we think about strategy, is the best strategy to focus on hiring and keeping the best employees? Do you think this is true or false? So I would say intuitively, of course, we want to hire and keep the best employees. But this is where I'm going to share my personal story with you. So there's basically four different, I can simplify it to say there's four strategies that an organization can focus on. And of course, we'd want to do more than one of these, but maybe every organization chooses one to be their competitive advantage. We could be a low-cost producer. We could focus on innovation. We could focus on quality, or we could focus on customer service. So think about each of your organizations and where do you think your strategy lies? Cost, innovation, quality, or customer service? And then think about how each of those strategies would even affect how you attract and manage your employees. And so here's the story. I did some research very early on in my PhD at a low-wage mattress factory. It was in Toronto. And I spent months there doing interviews, focus groups to try to give them recommendations for HR practices. And at the end of it all, the president said to me, "This is a complete waste of my time. I don't need to invest in HR." I can remember what I was wearing. Remember how I felt as I walked out of there thinking I just spent 13 years in university and worked here for 3 months doing all this research, and you just told me it was a waste of time. So I went back and I said, I need to understand where you're coming from. And he said, the focus of our strategy is to completely focus on cost. I don't care about quality. I don't care about innovation. I don't care about customer service. I'm only focusing on cost. And he said, at this time, 17 years ago, it was a stack of resumes. He said, I've got this stack of resumes on my desk. I can have someone here in an hour if I need them, and I can train them within 10 minutes. I don't need to invest in HR. Ethically, I have a huge problem with that, right? And as an HR professional, of course, we want to invest in HR practices, but you know what? He was onto something in that he was linking the strategy of his company with the way that he was leading and managing. And I think that's one last thought to leave you with, is that in addition to all of these other things that you need to think about, you need to think about what's my strategy, what's my competitive advantage, and how am I going to use that to affect how I'm going to lead and manage. And you're going to do it very differently if you're focusing on cost versus if you're focusing on customer service. So again, I will leave you with the 2 words, it depends, because I think everything we do, it depends on so many different factors. I do really hope that I get to see, and I can stay for questions. I do really hope that I get to see some of you in the discussion groups, and I really look forward to it. And if you look down now and did you write down 1 or 2 things that you could take away? I'd be happy if you took 1 thing away from the past hour. And I guess with that, I'll just turn it over to see if there's any questions.